I picked the wordiest readings ever this week. They're awful to keep in focus, and I'm sorry. They're just so lovely, though, that I couldn't help myself. These are texts that talk about rebuilding after traumatic events, about God's power and grace being enough to bring hope when it looks lost. They have imagery of healing and regrowth. They talk again and again about salvation and delivery, and this seems like a good time to claim those words and their biblical strength and power. Salvation comes from the root word of salve. To be saved is to be healed. Delivery has connotations of birth and of passing through a narrow place to get to safety and wholeness. Both words are used in the Bible to indicate God's actions for God's people. God moves the people to healing, to wholeness, to safety. God liberates. God heals. God creates safe places for liberation and healing to occur. If you, like me, have had a little bit too much exposure to Christian fundamentalists and to the narrative that salvation is about being saved from hell, I invite you to lay it down and let it go, because we aren't talking about that. In fact, Isaiah is talking about restoring the community of ancient Israel, piecing together those who had been left behind in the unprotected lands with those who had been force-marched into exile, and finding connection and wholeness again. Isaiah is talking about the horrors of violence, the battles and destruction of Jerusalem, and that they do not get to define the people any longer. It says, "No more shall your land be called devastated, but you shall be called, my delight is in her." Wow. The psalm presents itself as being more about an individual, which it may be. Sometimes it's hard to tell in the Bible if an individual is an individual or a way about talking about a group as a whole. It doesn't really matter, though. The truths hold in it either way. The psalmist expresses trust in God. The rock who gave me birth is my rock. And then goes on pretty quickly to mention the things that are not going well. The snares of death encompass me, etc. The psalmist cries out to God for help and experienced God listening and responding. I wonder if there's something important there. The psalm goes into quite a lot of detail about the strength of God's response. God heard, cared, and responded, and the earth shook. When any of us is responding to trauma, being reminded that God is, that God cares, and that God can help matters a lot. There's isolation and powerlessness that can keep trauma in place, but the reminder of God's presence and care can change that reality quite dramatically. Finally, the psalmist says God simply plucked them out of the danger and set them down somewhere safe, ending with, "She delivered me because she delights in me." What a profound conclusion. A definition of trauma that I find quite useful is exposure to an event which was perceived as intentionally threatening to mind, body, or spirit, accompanied by feelings of helplessness, powerlessness, and horror. You'll note that there are two parts to this definition: a threatening event and a sense that one couldn't do anything about it. It's also worth noting that the perception of the threat is key, not the reality of it, and that the threat can be to body, mind, or spirit. Trauma is incredibly common in our lives. Adverse childhood experiences studies look at 10 of the most common traumatic experiences of childhood, abuse, neglect, and family dysfunction, and find that 60 to 65% of adults experienced at least one of them in childhood. That's most people. Most people were seriously harmed in their childhoods. The prevalence of childhood trauma has dramatic effects on physical and mental health over the course of a lifetime. And of course, traumatic events occur in adult lives too. A particularly notable one would be a global pandemic, where there are threats to physical well-being in the form of a virus, and to mental and spiritual well-being in the form of separation. Clearly, there are a wide variety of experiences in the pandemic and experiences of the pandemic. Some people experienced far more trauma in the pandemic than others. And yet I think we have each experienced some trauma, and we have had a collective trauma. It may even be that we are still in the midst of experiencing collective trauma. I think it's really hard to tell for sure. While trauma has incredible impact on bodies, minds, and souls, it's important to pay attention to resiliency factors as well, because the impact of trauma is changed by the presence of resilience. Things like supportive friends, ways to engage with community, people to look up to, a sense of purpose, feeling valued, a sense of competency, opportunities for play. In my reading on trauma and resilience, I've been struck by how utterly imperative mirroring is. Mirroring are ways that people consciously or subconsciously reflect or mirror the emotions and feelings and aspirations of another. This has the impact of validating, accepting, and showing love for that person. Generally, when it comes to anger or outbursts, mirroring is less useful, but the naming of emotions can still help a lot. Mirroring gets a lot of attention in terms of parenting, but let's be real for a moment. For the adults in the room, a lot of life is about self-parenting ourselves and supporting others in their capacities to do the same. We have a lot of emotions, feelings, aspirations, and needs, and sometimes we all need help accepting them and finding them valid. Sometimes we can do it ourselves, regulating. Sometimes we do it best with others, co-regulating. And most of the time it's a mix. Mirroring and regulating feel central to these biblical passages about delivery from trauma, salvation after trauma, restoration to a full and abundant life. In Isaiah, God names the ways the community feels. It's heard and acknowledged, not dismissed. God is called the one who sees. In the ways the community has experienced the exile are named by God. The hope that is offered doesn't come out of the abstract. It meets the people where they are. In the psalm, first we hear the distress of the one who's struggling, and then we hear the ways God responds. And perhaps you need to hear this too. So keeping in mind the traumas of the past 3 years or so, see how it feels to hear this as God's response to the struggles you've lived through. Then the earth shuddered and quaked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and were shaken because of her anger. Smoke went up from her mouth. Burning coals blazed forth from her. She spread out the heavens and descended. A thick darkness was under her feet. She mounted up on a cherub and flew. She soared upon the wings of the wind. She made darkness her veil around her, her canopy dark waters and thick clouds. She reached down from on high. She took me. She drew me out of the multitude of waters. She delivered me from my strong enemy and from those who hate me, for they were too mighty for me. Well, I feel less alone and less frightened by my finitude when I hear God responding like that. And I've got to say, I rather like that the enemies aren't attacked. Rather, the psalmist is simply placed outside of their reach. When the psalmist brings fear and heartache, and then feels God mirroring, responding, helping, empowering, and bringing them to safety, the whole earth shakes, and God starts the process of rebuilding their life after the trauma. In Isaiah 2, the trauma is acknowledged in the mirroring, and then other healing starts too. There's dreaming and hoping, reframing and renaming and reconnecting. Trauma happens in human lives, individually and collectively. But trauma isn't the last word. God doesn't give up on us when we're struggling. God sees and hears, mirrors and responds, and helps us find the skills to regulate. God works to bring us to safe places. God delights in us even when we are broken by the trauma of our lives. We don't have to be healed or whole or trauma-free to be loved. God doesn't expect that of us. God sees and hears, mirrors and responds, loves and hopes. Trauma doesn't have the final word. Love and hope do. That is, God does. Amen.